On September 11, 2001, 2,972 people from more than 80 countries were killed, leaving thousands of loved ones behind. While grieving continued for many, some began to move beyond their personal pain.
I've directed the full resources of our intelligence and law enforcement communities to find those responsible and to bring them to justice.
Throughout the week after the attack, there were numerous accounts that the hijackers had a large number of accomplices in the United States.
75 individuals who are currently detained, over 480 people arrested, nearly 1,000 individuals.
The families waited for the 9/11 trials to begin, but they never came. After the public spectacle of roundups, the Justice Department quietly let the suspects go, one by one. A year later, the families would learn that only 6 of the original detainees were still in custody, and none had been charged with any terrorist act. By November, it had become the sense among most 9/11 families that an independent investigation would be necessary to do what the Justice Department and the news media seemed unwilling to do.
Senator Tom Daschle said last week that you called him several times and urged him not to investigate the events of September 11th.
Tom's wrong. He has, I think, in this case, let's say a misinterpretation.
He said on one occasion that the president asked him to do that at a breakfast meeting. Are you now saying that they weren't asking to block an investigation?
Realizing strength in numbers, 9/11 families rallied at the Capitol to press for answers. The rally united once isolated families. Bob McIlvaine, who lost his son Bobby, came from Philadelphia to join the group.
Being down Philly, it's like you're out of the loop. I was floundering by myself, just talking to people, trying to find anyone.
That was the first time we all got together in a new direction to push for the commission.
Sharing many of the same questions and concerns, a coalition of family members began to take form. Its goal, a formal investigation.
President Bush signed legislation today creating an independent commission to investigate the September 11th attack on America.
Buckling under pressure, the White House was finally agreeing to a deal. But in a stunning series of revelations, it soon appeared that the White House was stacking the odds against an investigation it had not wanted in the first place.
Remember, in the 90s, they spent $100 million investigating Clinton's sexual exploits. $100 million. And they first allocated only $3 million to investigate the murder of 3,000 people.
The budget was eventually raised to $14 million, but the investigation was also given less time than they had wanted, a year and a half. To monitor the commission, leading victim relatives established the Family Steering Committee. The group provided the commissioners with hundreds of well-researched questions for which they expected answers. In March of 2003, 441 days after the attacks, the official investigation began in New York.
Thank you very much. Mindy Kleinberg from September 11th Advocates.
On the morning of September 11th, my 3-year-old son Sam and I walked Jacob 10 and Lauren 7 to the bus stop at about 8:40 a.m.
Brad was 24 years old and the oldest of our 3 sons.
Family Steering Committee members were among the first to testify before the commission.
Hey, Mom, it's Brad. Just wanted to call and let you know. I'm sure that you heard, or maybe you haven't heard, that a plane crashed into World Trade Center 1. We're fine. We're in World Trade Center 2. I'm obviously alive and well over here, but obviously a pretty scary experience. I saw a guy fall out of probably the 91st story all the way down. So, you're welcome to give a call here. I think we'll be here all day. I'm not sure if the firm's going to shut down for the day or what. But give me a call back later. I called Dad to let him know. Love you.
Welcome, Mayor Michael Bloomberg of the City of New York.
From the outset, many families were concerned by how the investigation was being conducted.
We begged and pleaded that people should be put under oath. At the beginning, they were not.
Will describe our city government.
As the hearings progressed, the families were becoming more and more frustrated by what they perceived as softball questioning from the commissioners.
Complete waste of time. It was a bunch of people throwing accolades at each other and asking the same questions one after the other.
Skirting around issues, not being defined enough in their questions.
It's a stonewall. It's a cover-up. As far as I'm concerned, I'm very bitter. I'm very angry.
And with the investigation nearing its deadline, the President, Vice President, and National Security Advisor were still refusing to testify publicly. Yet few Americans were aware of the family's plight. Up till then, the hearings had received only minimal coverage. Suddenly, that all changed.
In testimony before the 9/11 Commission later this week, and in a new book to be published tomorrow, Against All Enemies, Clark will tell the story of what happened behind the scenes at the White House before, during, and after September 11th.
To the loved ones of the victims of 9/11, your government failed you. Those entrusted with protecting you failed you. And I failed you.
Clark's testimony provided the families with the timely leverage they needed to increase public pressure on reluctant White House witnesses.
The Bush administration will allow National Security Advisor Condoleezza Rice to testify publicly before the 9/11 Commission.
For President Bush, it was a dramatic reversal.
I've ordered this level of cooperation because I consider it necessary to gaining a complete picture of the months.
And even the President and Vice President agreed to meet with the Commission, but with a catch. They insisted on meeting together behind closed doors and not under oath.
President, why are you and the Vice President insisting on appearing together before the 9/11 Commission?
Because the 9/11 Commission wants to ask us questions. That's why we're meeting, and I look forward to meeting with them and answering their questions.
Why you're appearing together rather than separately, which was their request?
Because it's a good chance for both of us to answer questions that the 9/11 Commission is looking forward to asking us, and I'm looking forward to answering them. Let's see.
We have to have one story, so I'll say part, and if I get it wrong, hedge a little bit and give me the next.
I want to thank the Chairman and Vice Chairman for giving us a chance to share views on on different subjects. And they had a lot of good questions, and I'm glad I did it. I'm glad I took the time.
What topic did the commissioners want to spend most of the time on?
Probably best that I not go into the details of the conversation.
The President and Vice President of the United States, don't you think they should be able to stand up and speak their own words?
Deserve to have a transcript or to be able to see what you
Adam,
said?
you asked me that question yesterday. I got the same answer, yeah.
In July 2004, the Commission published its final report, the result in part of the family's 2.5-year struggle for answers.
Commission members have worked hard and served our country well. I speak for all Americans in thanking them for their fine work.
We, waited for the report to come out and were hopeful. I was always hopeful that we would get a report that answered my questions.
However, the Commission report failed to meet many of the family's expectations and concluded that 9/11 was merely a failure of imagination.
The percentage of the questions that got answered was very, very low. I'd say maybe 30% got touched upon, 70% didn't.
You can do an investigation, and if you don't really want to research an area, you just don't look at it. If you don't ask them all the questions or you don't let them tell you the whole story, then you could write a report based on half truth.
So there are all kinds of reasons. We thought we were set up to fail. We got started late. We had a very short time frame. Indeed, we had to get it extended. We did not have enough money. They were afraid we were going to hang somebody, that we would point the finger.
Lee and I write in our book that we think the Commission in many ways was set up to fail because we had not enough money. We didn't have enough time. We'd been appointed by the most partisan people in Washington.
Although I have given many lectures about 9/11, I had, prior to this one, never devoted an entire lecture to simply summarizing what I take to be the strongest evidence against the official account of 9/11. The Commission's lack of impartiality can be explained partly by the fact that Chairman Thomas Kean, most of the other commissioners, and at least half of the members of the staff had serious conflicts of interest. The most serious problem, however, is that the executive director, Philip Zelikow, was essentially a member of the Bush-Cheney administration. He had worked with Condoleezza Rice on the National Security Council in the administration of the first President Bush. Then, when the Republicans were out of office, he and Condoleezza Rice wrote a book together. Then, when she was named National Security Advisor for the second President Bush, she brought him on to help with the transition. Finally, then, he was appointed to the President's Foreign Intelligence Advisory Board. Zelikow was in position, therefore, to decide which topics would be investigated and which ones not. One disgruntled staff member reportedly said at the time, "Zelikow is calling the shots, he's skewing the investigation and running it his own way." Accordingly, the Commission was not independent from the executive branch. Insofar as the Commission was supposed to be investigating the failure of the Bush administration to prevent the attacks, the Commission was no more independent and impartial than if Dick Cheney had been running it. The only difference was that no one was shot. Another element of the official story about the alleged hijackers is that they were very devout Muslims. The 9/11 Commission report said that Atta had become very religious, even fanatically so. The public was thereby led to believe that these men would have no problem with a suicide mission because they were ready to meet their maker. But investigator-reporter Daniel Hopsicker discovered that Atta loved cocaine, alcohol, gambling, pork, and lap dances. Several of the other alleged hijackers had similar taste, reported the Wall Street Journal. Another problem in the official account is that although we are told that 4 or 5 of the alleged hijackers were on each of the flights, no proof of this claim has been provided. The story, of course, is that they did not force their way onto the planes, but they bought tickets. If so, their names should have been on the flight manifests. But the flight manifests that have been released contain neither the names of the alleged hijackers nor any Arab names whatsoever. We have also been given no proof that the remains of any of these men were found in the wreckage. One final little problem is that several of these 19 men, according to stories published by the BBC and British newspapers, are still alive. For example, the 9/11 Commission named Walid al-Shiri as one of the hijackers and reproduced the FBI's photograph of him. It even suggested that al-Shiri stabbed one of the flight attendants shortly before Flight 11 crashed into the North Tower. But as BBC News had reported 11 days after 9/11, al-Shiri, having seen his photograph in newspapers and TV programs, notified authorities and journalists in Morocco, where he works as his pilot, that he was still alive. But if there are various problems with the government's story about the hijackers, surely it proved its case about Osama bin Laden. Insofar as this belief is held, it is also a myth. The Taliban said that it would hand bin Laden over if the United States presented evidence of his involvement in 9/11. Bush refused.
By the way, Afghanistan's ruling Taliban movement on Tuesday said that Osama bin Laden, they are closely allied with him, was not responsible for the attacks on the United States. What happened in the United States, according to the Taliban, was not a job of ordinary people. It could have been the work of governments. Osama bin Laden cannot do this kind of work. Neither can we, a Taliban spokesman said from the southern city of Kandahar. The Taliban, of course, a very militant and very conservative Islamic organization and widely believed to be harboring Osama bin Laden, a very wealthy Saudi dissident.
There was no word from bin Laden, but the Taliban-ruled government of Afghanistan, where bin Laden is based, issued a statement this morning condemning the attacks and saying bin Laden did not have the capability to carry out such acts. And there were plenty of other suspects, ranging from radical Palestinian groups to rogue governments.
This failure to provide proof was later said to be unnecessary because bin Laden, in a video allegedly found in Afghanistan, admitted responsibility for the attacks. This confession is now widely cited as proof. But the man in this video has darker skin, fuller cheeks, and a broader nose than the Osama bin Laden of all other videos. We again seem to have planted evidence. There are, moreover, other problems in the official account of Osama bin Laden. For one thing, in June of 2001, when he was already America's most wanted criminal, he reportedly spent 2 weeks in the American hospital in Dubai, was treated by an American doctor, and visited by the local CIA agent. Also, after 9/11, when America was reportedly trying to get Osama dead or alive, the U.S. military evidently allowed him to escape on at least 4 occasions, the last one being the Battle of Tora Bora, which the London Telegraph labeled a grand charade. Shortly thereafter, Bush said, "I don't know where bin Laden is. I really don't care. It's not our priority." Sometimes the truth slips out.
6 months after he said Osama bin Laden must be caught dead or alive, this president was asked, "Where's Osama bin Laden?" He said, "I don't know. I don't really think about him very much. I'm not that concerned." We need a president who stays deadly focused on the real war on terror. Mr. President.
Gosh, I don't think I ever said I'm not worried about Osama bin Laden. It's kind of one of those exaggerations. So I don't know where he is. Nor, I just don't spend that much time on him. I repeat what I said. I truly am not that concerned about him.
About 10 months after 9/11, FBI Director Robert Mueller said, "To this day, we have found no one in the United States except the actual hijackers who knew of the plot." There is much evidence, however, that counts against this claim. One type of evidence involves an extraordinarily high volume of put options purchased in the 3 days prior to 9/11. To buy put options for a particular company is to bet that its stock price will go down. These extraordinary purchases included 2 and only 2 airlines, United and American, the 2 airlines used in the attacks. They also included Morgan Stanley Dean Witter, which occupied 22 stories of the World Trade Center. The price of these shares did, of course, plummet after 9/11, resulting in enormous profits for the purchasers. These unusual purchases, as the San Francisco Chronicle said, raised suspicions that the investors had advanced knowledge of the strikes. The 9/11 Commission tried to show these suspicions to be unfounded. It claimed, for example, that the purchases for United Airlines do not show anyone other than Al-Qaeda had foreknowledge because 95% of these options were purchased by a single U.S.-based institutional investor with no conceivable ties to Al-Qaeda. But the Commission thereby simply begged the question at issue, which is whether some organization other than Al-Qaeda was involved in the planning. U.S. officials have explained why the U.S. military did not prevent the attacks. The problem, however, is that they have given us 3 explanations. They are all mutually contradictory, and none of them is a satisfactory explanation. I will explain. According to a spokesperson, NORAD can scramble fighter jets within a matter of minutes to anywhere in the United States. An Air Force traffic control document put out in 1988 warned pilots that any airplanes persisting in unusual behavior will likely find 2 jet fighters on their tail within 10 or so minutes. If these procedures had been carried out on the morning of 9/11, American Airlines Flight 11 and United Flight 175 would have been intercepted before they could have reached Manhattan. And American Flight 77 would have been intercepted long before it could have reached the Pentagon. Such interceptions are routine, being carried out about 100 times a year. A month after 9/11, the Calgary Herald reported that in the year 2000, NORAD has scrambled fighters 129 times. Just a few days after 9/11, Major Mike Snyder, a NORAD spokesperson, told the Boston Globe that NORAD's fighters routinely intercept aircraft. Why did not such interceptions occur on 9/11? During the first few days, the public was told that no fighter jets were sent up until after the strike on the Pentagon at 9/38. However, it was also reported that signs of Flight 11's hijacking had been observed at 8:15. That would mean that although interceptions usually occur within 10 or so minutes after signs of trouble are observed, in this case, 80 or so minutes had elapsed before fighters were even airborne. This story suggested that a stand-down order had been given. Within a few days, however, a second story was put out, according to which NORAD had sent fighters up, but because notification from the FAA had been very tardy, the fighters arrived too late. On September 18th, NORAD made this second story official, embodying it in a timeline which indicated when NORAD had been notified by the FAA about each airplane and when it had scrambled fighters in response. Critics quickly showed, however, that even if the FAA notifications had come as late as NORAD's timeline indicated, NORAD's jets would have had time to make interceptions. The second story did not, therefore, remove the suspicion that a stand-down order had been given. Hoping to overcome this problem, the 9/11 Commission report provided a third account, but there are three big problems with this third story. One problem is the very fact that it is the third story. Normally, when a suspect in a criminal investigation keeps changing his story, we get suspicious. Let's say that the police asked Charlie Jones where he was on the night of a particular crime. He says he was at the movie theater, but they say, no, the movie theater's been closed all week. Oh, Charlie says, that's right, I was with my girlfriend. No, the police say, we checked with her and she was home with her husband. At that point, Charlie says, oh, now I remember, I was home reading the Bible. You're probably not going to believe Charlie. And yet that's what we have here. The military told one story right after 9/11, another story a week later, and a third through the 9/11 Commission report in 2004. The second problem with this third story is that it contradicts several features of the second story, which had served as the official story for almost 3 years. For example, NORAD's timeline had indicated that the FAA had notified it about Flight 175 20 minutes before the South Tower was struck, and notified it about Flight 77 at least 14 minutes before the Pentagon was struck. The 9/11 Commission maintains that both of these statements were incorrect, that really there had been no notification about these flights until after they hit their targets. This was why the military failed to intercept them. But if NORAD's timeline was false, as the Commission now claims, NORAD must have been either lying or confused. But it is hard to believe that it could have been confused 1 week after 9/11. So it must have been lying. But if NORAD was lying then, why should we believe them now? Because of these and still more problems, which I have discussed in a lecture called Flights of Fancy, this third story does not remove the grounds for suspicion that a stand-down order had been given. There is, moreover, ear witness testimony for this suspicion. An upper management official at LAX, who needs to remain anonymous, told me that he overheard members of LAX security, including officers from the FBI and the LAPD, interacting on their walkie-talkies shortly after the attacks. At first, the LAX officials were furious because they were told that the airplanes that attacked the World Trade Center and the Pentagon had not been intercepted because the FAA had not notified NORAD about the hijackings. But later, he reports, they were even more furious because they were told that NORAD had been notified but did not respond because it had been ordered to stand down. When LAX security officials asked who had issued that order, they were told that it came from the highest level of the White House. That, of course, would mean Cheney. To move to myth number 8, official reports have explained why the Twin Towers and Building 7 of the World Trade Center collapsed. This claim suffers from the same problem as the previous one. We have had 3 explanations, each of which contradicts the others, and none of which is anywhere near adequate. The first explanation, widely disseminated through television specials, was that the buildings collapsed because their steel columns were melted by the jet fuel-fed fires. But this explanation contained many problems, the most obvious of which is that steel does not begin to melt until about 2,800 degrees Fahrenheit, while open fires based on hydrocarbons such as kerosene, which is what jet fuel is, cannot, even under the most ideal circumstances, rise above 1,700 degrees. A second explanation, endorsed by the 9/11 Commission report, is a pancake theory, according to which the fires, while not melting the steel, heated it up sufficiently to cause the floors weakened by the airplane strikes to break loose from the steel columns. All the floors above the strike zone hence fell down on the floor below the strike zone, causing it to break free, and this started a chain reaction so that the floors pancaked all the way down. But this explanation also suffered from many problems, the most obvious of which was that it could not explain why the buildings collapsed into a pile of rubble only a few stories high. The core of each of the twin towers consisted of 47 massive steel columns. If the floors had broken loose from them, these columns would have still been sticking up into the air 1,000 feet. The definitive explanation was supposed to be a third one, issued by the National Institute for Standards and Technology, usually called NIST. The NIST report claimed that when the floors collapsed, they, rather than breaking free from the columns, pulled on them, causing the perimeter columns to become unstable. This instability then increased the gravity load on the core columns, which had been weakened by tremendously hot fires in the core, which NIST claims reached over 1,800 degrees Fahrenheit. And this combination of factors resulted in global collapse. But as physicists Jim Hoffman and Stephen Jones have shown, this account is riddled with problems. One of these is that NIST's claim about the tremendously hot fires in the core is completely unsupported by the evidence or logic. And this is only to begin to enumerate the problems in NIST's theory, all of which follow from the fact that it, like the previous two theories, is essentially a fire theory, according to which the buildings were brought down primarily by fire. In the case of the Twin Towers, of course, the impact of the airplanes is said to have played a role. But most experts who support the official theory attribute the collapses primarily to the fire. NIST, for example, says that the main contribution of the airplanes, aside from providing jet fuel, was to dislodge a lot of the fireproofing from the steel, thereby making it vulnerable to the fires. By the way, when you go home tonight and light your fire in your fireplace, be sure to fireproof your steel, or the grate may collapse. But these fire theories face several formidable problems. First, the fires in these three buildings were not very hot, very big, or very long-lasting, compared with fires in some steel frame high-rises that did not collapse. The collapse of Building 7 has been recognized as especially difficult to explain. It was not hit by a plane, so the explanation has to rely solely on fire, and yet because there was no jet fuel to get a big fire started, this building had fires on only 2 or 3 floors, according to several witnesses and all photographic evidence. The 9/11 Commission report implicitly admitted that it could not explain the collapse of this building by not even mentioning it. In any case, a third problem with the official account of the collapses of these three buildings is that all prior and subsequent collapses, total collapses of steel frame high-rises, have been caused by explosives in the procedure known as controlled demolition. This problem is made even more severe by the fact that the collapses of these three buildings manifested many features of the most difficult type of controlled demolition known as implosion. I will mention 7 such features. First, the collapses began suddenly. Steel, if weakened by fire, would gradually begin to sag. But as one can see from the videos available on the web, all three buildings are completely motionless up to the moment they begin to collapse. Second, if these huge buildings had toppled over, They would have caused enormous death and destruction in lower Manhattan, but they came straight down. This straight down collapse is the whole point of controlled implosion. Third, these buildings collapsed at virtually free fall speed, which means that the lower floors, with all their steel and concrete, were offering virtually no resistance. Fourth, as mentioned earlier, these collapses were total collapses, resulting in piles of rubble only a few stories high. This means that the enormous steel columns in the core of each building had to be broken into rather short segments, which is what explosives do. Fifth, great quantities of molten steel were produced, which means that the steel had been heated up to several thousand degrees. Sixth, according to many firefighters, medical workers, journalists, and World Trade Center employees, many explosions went off both before and during the collapses. A seventh feature of controlled implosions is the production of large quantities of dust. In the case of the Twin Towers, virtually everything except the steel, all the concrete, the desks, the computers, was pulverized into very tiny dust particles. The official story cannot explain one, let alone all seven of these features, at least, as Hoffman and Jones point out, without violating several basic laws of physics. But the controlled demolition theory easily explains all these features. These findings are inconsistent with the idea that al-Qaeda terrorists were responsible. Foreign terrorists could not have gotten access to those buildings for all the hours it would have taken to plant the explosives. Also, al-Qaeda terrorists probably would not have had the courtesy to make sure that the buildings came straight down rather than toppling over. The Bush-Cheney administration, by contrast, could have gotten such access, especially given the fact that Marvin Bush and Wirt Walker III, the president's brother and cousin respectively, were principals of the company in charge of security for the World Trade Center. Evidence was also apparently planted. The passport of one of the hijackers on Flight 11 was allegedly found in the rubble. Having survived the fiery infernal, I'm not making this up. The passport had survived not only the fiery inferno caused by the airplane, but also whatever caused everything else in these buildings to be pulverized into tiny dust. The magic passport. We have, in the first place, reasons to doubt that the aircraft that hit the Pentagon was under the control of Hani Hanjour. For one thing, the aircraft, before striking the Pentagon, reportedly executed a 270-degree downward spiral, and yet Hani Hanjour was known as a terrible pilot who could not safely fly even a small plane. A second major problem with the official story. There are reasons to believe that the Pentagon was struck only because officials at the Pentagon wanted it to be struck. For one thing, Flight 77 allegedly, after making a U-turn in the Midwest, flew back to Washington undetected for 40 minutes. And yet the U.S. military, which by then clearly would have known that hijacked airliners were being used as weapons, has the best radar systems in the world, one of which, it brags, does not miss anything occurring in North American airspace.
Were you there when that order was given?
No, I was not. I was made aware of it during the time that the airplane coming in to the Pentagon, there was a young man who would come in and say to the vice president, the plane is 50 miles out, the plane is 30 miles out. And when it got down to the plane is 10 miles out, the young man also said to the vice president, do the orders still stand? And the vice president turned and whipped his neck around and said, of course the orders still stand. Have you heard anything to the contrary?
The idea that a large airliner could have slipped through is absurd. Also, the Pentagon is surely the best defended building on the planet. The Pentagon, moreover, is reportedly protected by batteries of surface-to-air missiles. So if any aircraft without a U.S. military's transponder were to enter the Pentagon's airspace, it would be shot down. So even if the aircraft that hit the Pentagon was Flight 77, it could have succeeded only because officials in the Pentagon turned off their missiles, as well as ordering the fighters from Andrews to stand down.
At any point during this day, were you just, in a very base way, afraid?
There were many times, Miles, that you were afraid. You were worried, especially when I was standing in front of the Pentagon that night, seeing one of our fortresses pried open by a missile airplane, seeing one of our fortresses pried open by a missile airplane.
They don't tell you that, they do mention that it was the west wing of the Pentagon that was hit. They don't mention that for terrorists who wanted to really strike a blow at the Pentagon, the west wing was the least likely part to hit. Why? Because all the big brass are in the east wing. That's where Rumsfeld and all the top generals are. Furthermore, the west wing was being renovated. So it was reinforced so the fire wouldn't spread to the rest of the building. Also, there were very few people there. And so, although it's tragic that 125 people on the ground were killed, several thousand would have been killed if the plane had hit any other. Well, if it had been a plane, we'll come to that later. But even what it was, it would have killed several hundred and maybe 1,000 if it had been an ordinary place. Furthermore, as I said, it was the hardest place of the Pentagon to hit. You've got this huge Pentagon here with acres. All you had to do was fly right into the ceiling, right into the roof, and you would have done, you couldn't have missed. Even Hani Hanjour could have hit it.
The day before 9/11, Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld declared war, not on foreign terrorists.
The adversary is closer to home. It's the Pentagon bureaucracy.
He said money wasted by the military poses a serious threat.
In fact, it could be said that it's a matter of life and death. According to some estimates, we cannot track $2.3 trillion in transactions.
$2.3 trillion with a T. That's $8,000 for every man, woman, and child in America.
The day before 9/11, on the 10th of September, Donald Rumsfeld holds a press conference and talks about they can't account for $2.3 trillion of Pentagon expenses.
According to some estimates, we cannot track $2.3 trillion in transactions.
And amazingly, the exact place that, quote, plane hit was where all the computers and data were stored at for what Rumsfeld talked about.
Yeah, it's unthinkable until you think about it. More than records were lost in the impact area. One Army office lost 34 of its 65 employees. The office was called Resource Services Washington. The victims were at their desks. Most were civilians, bookkeepers, accountants, budget analysts, the folks who'd know most about a cover-up and who was stealing the money.
It's an extension of the original op. Getting 2 for 1. You're putting planes into the World Trade Center to send us off to war. Wait a minute, let me finish. To send us off to war. On top of it, why wouldn't we add a little icing to the cake? We got some major troubles in the Pentagon. If we send a missile in there and blow it up, no one will ever talk about that September 10th press conference again.
The facade, even though it was hit by a Boeing 750, this is the official story, Boeing 757 going 400 miles an hour, got a wingspan of 125 feet, got these enormous engines on it, got a tail that makes the plane 40 feet high. It didn't knock the facade down for a half hour. The facade stood after being hit by the plane for a half hour before it fell down.
From my close-up inspection, there's no evidence of a plane having crashed anywhere near the Pentagon. The only site is the actual site of the building that's crashed in, and as I said, the only pieces left that you can see are small enough that you could pick up in your hand. There are no large tail sections, wing sections, a fuselage, nothing like that anywhere around, which would indicate that the entire plane crashed into the side of the Pentagon and then caused the side to collapse. Now, even though if you look at the pictures of the Pentagon, you see that the floors have all collapsed, that didn't happen immediately. It wasn't until almost about 45 minutes later that the structure was weakened enough that all of the floors collapsed.
Photographs were taken by Marines and other military people and Tom Horan of the Associated Press. They show you that the hole that was created by this Boeing 757 was about 20 feet in diameter. 20 feet in diameter. That's big enough to get the nose of a Boeing inside. So, there ought to be a Boeing sitting out there in front. Tom Horan's pictures, other pictures show there's no Boeing. This French researcher, Thierry Masson, has a website called Hunt the Boeing. And he shows all these photographs. Say, look outside? No Boeing. Well, let's go inside. No Boeing. So they asked Ed Plower, the fire chief, who was in charge of putting out. What'd you see in there, Ed? This was at the Pentagon press conference the next day. He obviously hadn't been coached, and he said, no big pieces of anything, no fuselage, no, nothing like that. And then two other people get up. One of them was the head of the renovation project. And said, yeah, no big pieces of anything, nothing sticking up in the air. A Boeing 757 is pretty big. Why don't they just release the videos and show us? You know, there are cameras there, cameras on hotels next door. There's a camera in the gas station across the street. All you have to do is show us the videos and you can prove it was a Boeing 757. No. They didn't show us any. They finally, after Thierry Masson came out with his theory that it wasn't a Boeing but a missile, they released 5 frames that they said proved it. Some people have looked at those frames and said, that's when I became a skeptic, because that was not a Boeing. Furthermore, this video that was across the street, within 5 minutes of the attack, the FBI was over there and confiscated it. You would think the FBI would be distraught. Hey, for the first time in history, the Pentagon has been hit. No, they had the presence of mind to get in their cars and drive over there and confiscate the video. We've never seen it. Then, one of the most dishonest things in the Commission report is they actually bring this up. Because one of the criticisms have been these flights that were going to New York, they passed by one of the biggest nuclear plants right along the river there. All they had to do was attack that. That would have caused far more devastation than any of these attacks on the World Trade Center. It would have, killed hundreds of thousands of people, poisoned the area, ruined the economy of the United States, if that's what these terrorists wanted to do, because they hate freedom and democracy. But they didn't. They flew right over and went and hit the World Trade Center. So what does the 9/11 Commission tell you? Well, they have this guy named, they call him KSM, Khalid Sheikh Mohammed. And they've captured him, they tell us. Well, he's this font of information. And they just say anything they want to, and they say, this is what KSM told us. We have no way of checking this. They just tell us, he was the mastermind. So what he told him was, well, yeah, we thought about hitting a nuclear plant, but, we said, they're probably guarded. They probably have missiles around there. We'd probably get shot down. So let's go hit the Pentagon. It's surely... And I hate to say it, I'm not making this up. So when you hear that this report is the #1 bestseller of the year, and also you go on Amazon and look at the reports, the ratings, customer ratings, at least the last time I looked, 9 out of 10 were 5 stars. People are saying, now we know the truth.
Stretch. Big stretch. I'm sorry.
Mr. President. I know you said there'll be a time for politics, but you've also said you wanted to change the tone of Washington. Howard Dean recently seemed to muse aloud whether you had advanced knowledge of 9/11. Do you agree or disagree with the RNC that this kind of rhetoric borders on political hate speech?
Yeah. Look, there's time for politics. And, It's time for politics, and there's an old saying in Tennessee, I know it's in Texas, probably in Tennessee, that says, "Fool me once, shame on you." If fool me, we can't get fooled again.
Still, despite years of investigation and advocacy by the families and others, the official story of what really happened on September 11th remains little changed.
There was a time in South Africa that people would put flaming tires around people's necks if they dissented. And in some ways, the fear is that you'll be necklaced here. You'll have a flaming tire of lack of patriotism put around your neck. Now, it's that fear that keeps journalists from asking the toughest of the tough questions.
So all this information keeps popping out here and there, but what happens is that no one wants to take the ball and run with it, because all the information's there. If we could put it together and get it into the Washington Post as a 10-day series, and people are saying, unbelievable.
This is a scandal of tremendous proportions. It makes Watergate look small. But there's a strange lack of interest of people both on the left and on the right. Nobody seems to want to uncover the truth and just follow leads wherever they may go, because I think that goes to a lot of really damaging places.
Maybe we shouldn't have questioned whether or not President Nixon had any involvement in Watergate. Maybe we should have just accepted that story. Maybe we should have accepted the story that President Clinton had no involvement, had never had sex with that woman, Miss Lewinsky. So just because it's the official story of record does not mean that we should not delve further and to see if really that is the actual story.
We have to go beyond the myth and get to the truth. We have to know. We have to.
9/11 was the biggest don't ask, don't tell. And if it wasn't for the families, we wouldn't have anything. And that's very frightening.
We had to take this tragedy and do the best we could with our lives and with our country to try and make the people that are supposed to protect us do the right thing.
What I really wanted to happen here is for my children to feel safe. I could have cared less who was in office. I wanted the truth, and I wanted what was wrong to be fixed.
What we're left with after our journey is no answers, no accountability, and I've wasted 4 years of my life trying my damnedest, along with the other family members, to make sure this never happens again.
Let me just say something real quickly about my son, please. On the wall in his room, it said, "Knowledge is power." I am only doing this for one reason and one reason only, to carry on his legacy. I'm so pissed off at the American people. I'm so pissed off at this government because of this cover-up.
John Gerard Coughlin. Timothy J. Coughlin.
Anne Marie Kramer.
Christopher Seaton Kramer. And my big brother, Wade Brian Green. We miss you, we love you, and you are always in our hearts.
Before this week's trading, the Dow lost more than 351 points. That's 3% of its overall value. NASDAQ was off almost 93. That's more than a 4% drop for the week. We'll take a break here.